So, I want to talk to you today about just one of the figures that we're interested in, someone who did not receive as much attention during the Deist controversy as some of the others we'll be reading, but is, I think, an important figure for other reasons. I want to discuss the work of Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, who died in 1713, and in particular want to pay attention to one of his works, The Characteristics of Men, Matters, Opinions, Times. Everyone concurred that Shaftesbury was an elegant writer, and as this was one of the last things that he ever wrote, written, as you can see, just 2 years before his death, and revised by him right up to the point of his death, so that a second edition was published just after he died, this has to represent his mature thinking. In the Characteristics, Shaftesbury gives a very inconsistent representation of his position. Sometimes he says fair-sounding things, and at other times he is quite vicious with respect to Christianity in particular. So this has led to some dispute, and even Leland, in his view of the deistical writers, when he writes his chapter, actually 2 chapters on Shaftesbury, reports that some people were very sorry to see that he was construing him as a deist, and said, no, look, he says all of these fair-sounding things. And Leland replied, well, yes, he does, but he speaks out of both sides of his mouth, as it were. So I think Leland is right, and that Shaftesbury's fairer-sounding statements were a cover for his more radical ideas. Shaftesbury's thought has certain distinctive features. I'm going to focus on 4 of them. First, that the doctrine of future rewards and punishments, of heaven and hell, is pernicious and tends to make men behave badly here on earth. That skepticism about the scriptures is a natural suspicion. That reported miracles are no evidence for a religion, and anything short of direct personal inspiration leaves us in a form of skepticism. And finally, that ridicule is an appropriate method of testing religious beliefs. These views are important because they influenced not only the deists and skeptics of Shaftesbury's time, but also the deists and skeptics and atheists of later times. And I will give a couple of illustrations of that as we move forward to show that Shaftesbury's thought is by no means simply a dead piece of history. On the doctrine of future rewards and punishments, here are some quotations from Shaftesbury. It is customary, he says, with many devout people zealously to decry all temporal advantages of goodness, all natural benefits of virtue, and magnifying to contrary happiness of a vicious state, to declare that except only for the sake of future reward and fear of future punishment, they would divest themselves of all goodness at once and freely allow themselves to be most immoral and profligate. Notice that he puts these sayings, these sentiments, in quotation marks. Does he name any actual people who have said this? No, he does not. So we are left wondering whether these are actual people or are characters of Shaftesbury's literary imagination. From whence it appears, he goes on, that in some respects there can be nothing more fatal to virtue than the weak and uncertain belief of a future reward and punishment. For the stress being laid wholly here, if this foundation come to fail, there is no further prop or security to men's morals, and thus virtue is supplanted and betrayed. This is from the Characteristics, Volume 2, and I've given you some places to go look at that. Now, think of that and compare that to a modern-day Shaftesbury, Michael Shermer. Here's something that Shermer tweeted last week. If you found out tonight that there was no God, what would you do? Would you lose your morality? Would you lose your sense of right and wrong? Would you turn to a life of crime and sin? If no, then you don't need God to be good. If yes, then you are morally disturbed. Notice more than a casual echo here of Shaftesbury's line of thought. People who say that but for God they would fail to be virtuous are in a very dangerous position indeed and are morally disturbed. Very well, but does this actually correspond to the people that Shermer and Shaftesbury are critiquing? That question needs to be addressed more directly than either of them have done it. How about Shaftesbury's view of Scripture? It is, he says, a natural suspicion of those who are called skeptical that the holy records themselves were no other than the pure invention or artificial compilement of an interested party in behalf of the richest corporation and most profitable monopoly which could be erected in the world. That doesn't sound very flattering. What's he getting at there? Well, in Shaftesbury's own time, of course, the church in England was supported. It was the religion of the nation. The monarch was the head of that religion. And for that reason, it was a very profitable thing for many who were set up in that way. If you had a wealthy bishopric, you could count on becoming the equivalent of a modern-day multi-millionaire. You could acquire vast wealth. We'll talk more about how some of the deists and skeptics used that as a critique of the church. Here, Shaftesbury just casually insinuates that this is a good way to get rich quick. Start your own religion. And it must be admitted that in some cases, as with, say, Sathya Sai Baba, it, in the proper environment, can lead to someone's acquiring great wealth. Sathya Sai Baba, when he died, had a net estate of, I believe, over £4 billion, British pounds. So that's, for those of you who like to do quick math, it's nearly $10 billion. So starting a religion in the proper circumstances is a great way to get rich quick. Whether that can be applied to the Christian religion is an entirely different question. But Shaftesbury, at the moment, isn't concerned to push it that far. How about enthusiasm and miracles? Writing to his friend, he says, "Other reasons, my lord, there are why this plain, homespun philosophy of looking into ourselves may do us wondrous service in rectifying our errors in religion, for there is a sort of enthusiasm of second hand. And when men find no original commotions in themselves, no prepossessing panic which bewitches them, they are apt still by the testimony of others to be imposed on, and led credulously into the belief of many false miracles. And this habit may make them variable and of a very inconstant faith, easy to be carried away with every wind of doctrine and addicted to every start-up sect or superstition. But the knowledge of our passions in their very seeds, the measuring well the growth and progress of enthusiasm, and the judging rightly of its natural force, and what command it has over our very senses, may teach us to oppose more successfully those delusions which come armed with the specious pretext of moral certainty and matter of fact." What Shaftesbury is doing here resembles significantly some of the things that David Hume says in part 2 of his famous essay of miracles. The idea that our passions may carry us away should lead us to be cynical about things that are declared to be moral certainty and matter of fact. Of course, moral certainty and matter of fact were phrases that were common in the theological literature of the time, and so Shaftesbury is taking not very disguised aim at those writers who proclaim those things, and is setting himself up as a more cynical and judicious judge of religious passions. He has more to say about miracles, though. "The best Christian in the world who, being destitute of the means of certainty, depends only on history and tradition for his belief in these particulars, the particulars of the gospel that would be, is at best but a skeptic Christian. He has no more than a nicely critical historical faith, subject to various speculations, and 1,000 different criticisms of languages and literature." 3 things I think are worth noting here. The first is, what are these means of certainty? Well, that is the immediate testimony of the Holy Spirit, bringing it home to him directly, which, however, when Shaftesbury is writing about it in a different place, he would characterize as mere enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is a technical term in philosophical and religious writing at this time, and it's a term of contempt. It is used for people who are carried away by their imaginations and their passions at the detriment of their reasons. It was one of the principal charges made against the Wesleyans when John Wesley first began preaching. People got carried away and did crazy things. They would faint clean away, they would sigh and scream and undergo convulsions, and these kinds of things were, to a sober Englishman, very odd and not very attractive. So Shaftesbury says here, well, you have to depend upon your own immediate inspiration, and yet elsewhere he's very contemptuous of that immediate inspiration. That combination of recommending it and yet disparaging it, that is, disparaging personal revelation, is also something that we find, and this would be a possible pattern match for those of you who are looking for a paper topic, in the work of Henry Dodwell, Jr., who wrote a deistical work called Christianity Not Founded on Argument. So some of you might want to explore the relationship between Shaftesbury's work here and Dodwell, and the way in which he assumes the guise of an earnest, devout Christian in order to critique the rational grounds of Christianity. One other thing here is the connection between what he says at the end about 1,000 different criticisms of languages and literature and what we have already seen from Herbert and Blount about the difficulty of engaging in a scholarly study of the truth of Christianity. Shaftesbury is, in an indirect fashion, lending his endorsement to the idea that if you try to do this all in a scholarly fashion, you'll simply get lost in the details, that there is no way that almost anyone, much less someone who is only of average abilities and opportunities, can have faith grounded in this rational fashion. But now we come to the final thing I want to discuss in today's lecture, and I'm going to take a little bit more time over this. That's Shaftesbury on the use of ridicule and wit. Shaftesbury writes about this repeatedly. He comes back to this in volume after volume. I can easily apprehend, he says, what effect awe has over men's understandings. I can very well suppose men may be frightened out of their wits, but I have no apprehension, no fear, that is. They should be laughed out of them. A mannerly wit can hurt no cause or interest for which I am in the least concerned. Well, a mannerly wit, laughing, what does that have to do with determining truth? Shaftesbury thinks actually it has quite a lot. The vulgar, indeed, may swallow any sordid jest, any mere drollery or buffoonery, but it must be a finer and truer wit, which takes with men of sense and breeding. What rule or measure is there in the world except in the considering of the real temper of things to find which are truly serious and which ridiculous? And how can this be done? Unless by applying the ridicule to see whether it will bear. But if we fear to apply this rule in anything, what security can we have against the imposture of formality in all things? Ridicule, jest, but only for those of sense and breeding, of course, men much like Shaftesbury himself, who could plead his noble blood and his refined education. Well, with such men, a coarse jest will not take, and so we needn't fear. And after all, it isn't the crowds that we have to worry about, it's only men of nobility, like Shaftesbury himself, that we have to worry about. They won't be taken in by raillery and wit brought in a bad cause. So here Shaftesbury is setting up people much like himself as the experts, and saying that the only method by which we can determine the truth in some of these matters is to see whether we can mock it, and whether that will be accepted by men of good breeding and good education and good sense. If it strikes you that it's a little bit odd to think that there's no other test of truth than that of mockery, then you're in good company. Happy it was for us that when prophecy had got possession, Smithfield was used in a more tragical way. Many of our first reformers, 'tis feared, were little better than enthusiasts, And God knows whether a warmth of this kind did not considerably help us in throwing off that spiritual tyranny, so that had not the priests, as is usual, preferred the love of blood to all other passions, they might in a merrier way, perhaps, have evaded the greatest force of our reforming spirit. What is he talking about here? Smithfield was the location where Bloody Mary, who was queen just before Elizabeth, had Protestants burned between 1553 and 1558. Mostly, these were Protestants of the peasant class, working men, not the nobility. If there were nobility who harbored Protestant sentiments, they could often evade being burned alive. But several hundred Protestants were burned in Smithfield. So here Shaftesbury is doing two things. He is assuming that his readers will be on his side in deploring what happened in Smithfield, because that was done by Catholics. But second, and more subtly, he's saying that wasn't really such a severe trial at all. What if we had been laughed at and mocked instead of being burned alive? Now, that would have been a harder trial. And if they had done that, then perhaps we would have been overthrown. The Reformation would not have taken hold in England. Mocked in what way? Well, when he's talking about a contemporary sect of French camisards who had come over and begun to make claims to prophecy. Apparently there was a place in Bartlemy Fair where they were lampooned in a puppet show, kind of a Punch and Judy show. They were laughed at and mocked, and their characteristic manners and proclamations were satirized, and he thinks that was a great thing and very powerful for suppressing false pretenses to prophecy. But notice what he's doing here. He's suggesting that had this same method been applied to the Reformation, it never would have taken hold in England. He's not done. He's going to go further. I have never heard, he says, that the ancient heathens were so well advised in their ill purpose of suppressing the Christian religion in its first rise as to make use at any time of this Bartlemy Fair method. But this I am persuaded of, that had the truth of the gospel been in any way surmountable, they would have been much fairer for the silencing it if they had chosen to bring our primitive founders upon the stage in a pleasanter way than that of bearskins and pitch barrels, referring there at the end to two of the ways that early Christians were martyred. So really what needs to be done is to mock religion. If you mock religion, if you make a show of it, if you bring it to contempt, that's the most effective way of suppressing it. All the while, of course, giving himself the out that if it's true, then with men of good sense and breeding, the jest won't stick. They won't allow you to get away with it. How does Shaftesbury undertake to support his claim about the value of wit and ridicule? You may have noticed a conspicuous lack of argument here. He is assuming that you will accept what he says and that you will not ask for evidence or proof of it. So let's do a historical cross-check from Bishop Burnet. Remember, Smithfield was the site of the burnings of the Protestants from 1553 onward. Well, Bishop Burnet tells us that in the year 1542, plays and interludes were a great abuse. In them, mock representations were made both of the clergy and of the pageantry of their worship. That would be the Catholic clergy. The clergy complained much of these as an introduction to atheism, when things sacred were thus laughed at, and said that they who begun to laugh at abuses would not cease till they had represented all the mysteries of religion as ridiculous. The graver sort of reformers did not approve of it, but political men encouraged it and thought nothing could more effectually pull down the abuses that yet remained than the exposing them to the scorn of the nation. This from one of Shaftesbury's critics, Brown. So what's he saying? Yeah, we tried that. Back when Catholicism was regnant, it was attempted to have plays and interludes and to make fun of them and their pageantry and their ceremonies and their worship. And what did that get us? Well, 11 years later, Protestants were being burned alive in Smithfield. How's that? That doesn't look like it was working very well. But Brown is not done. This is John Brown, by the way, and I've asked John to load this up into the SDA database, so you should have a copy of it in some version or another available. Brown goes on, "Be you well assured of this, kind reader, that whatever impressions are made upon a populace in the way of scenery and dramatic representation are no more than so many kinds of silent eloquence and persuasion." You would almost think that he had foreseen the modern age of media. That facts which ought to be proved are always taken for granted, and things and persons often rendered apparently absurd which really are not so. That the vulgar, both high and low, little shaft there at Shaftesbury, the vulgar, both high and low, are apt to swallow any sordid jest or buffoonery, so it be but accommodated to their preconceived opinions. That this way of ridicule, like every other, is as fairly or dishonestly applied, will sweep away truth or falsehood without distinction. That therefore Christianity had indeed more to fear from the contemptuous misrepresentations than the bitterest rage of its enemies, that Christianity did in fact endure this more than fiery trial, that its divine founder was derided as well as crucified. Yes, I think maybe there was a little bit of communication there backwards in time from Neil Postman to John Brown. Periodically throughout this course, I'm trying to point out that the issues and the arguments that we are discussing are still relevant to our own time. In this case, we have a modern-day Shaftesbury, Richard Dawkins, who, in some very widely publicized remarks a few years ago, speaking of the people who defend religion, said, "Mock them, ridicule them, in public. Don't fall for the convention that we're all too polite to talk about religion. Religion is not off the table. Religion is not off limits. Religion makes specific claims about the universe which need to be substantiated and need to be challenged and, if necessary, need to be ridiculed with contempt." Ridiculed with contempt. You can find a clip of Dawkins saying this on YouTube. Does it sound familiar? Part of the reason for reading people in previous times is to discover that times that may have seemed far removed from our own are actually much like the present, that human nature is not much different, that many of the means by which controversy is carried on are very similar to the means by which it's carried on today. So I'm giving you this just as one point. You can find many more data points yourself where Shaftesbury's idea of using ridicule has come forward into the modern age, if anything, debased beyond what he professed, and showing the truth of John Brown's observation that if it falls in line with people's preconceived opinions, it will be accepted on almost any subject, true or false.